Dr. Paula, thank you very much for your time
Thank
for
you.
our interview today.
Mhm.
We're really looking forward to have a great conversation. Let me first start with your own impression of the U.S. election that everybody in the world is talking about. It was quite surprising, because many indicators, news outlets and journalism and survey companies all indicate the other candidate had a better chance.
Yes, yes.
So who and what we have missed?
Well, first of all election outcomes are based on probabilities that then reflect the turnout that one receives. And in this case, there was clearly misestimation both on turnout and the intensity of support for the respective candidates. And in a way, it should remind us that there can always be surprises in this process. To me, what's kind of interesting is that as people analyze this as a big challenge to the status quo and so forth, when in fact the voter turnout was quite low. Total turnout of the electorate was about 57%.
Correct.
Mr. Trump received about 1 million votes less than Governor Romney did 4 years ago, but for Hillary Clinton, she received about 5 million less than Barack Obama received 4 years ago. So turnout really, really matters, and of course the turnout and in what specific areas. But beyond anything else, the surprise element was that the polling data seemed so consistent, even though it suggested a close election result in different states. Very few imagined that everything would in effect break correctly for Mr. Trump and against Hillary Clinton, and that's exactly what happened. So now he's president, or will be soon.
Indeed.
Yeah.
If you look at state by state, many states went to the party that everybody expected, but there were some surprising
Yes.
results. Florida is one. The second was Rust Belt, we call, including Pennsylvania. Many people analyzed that the loss of Florida and the Rust Belt was detrimental for the loss of Madam Clinton. And why she failed to win vote in Rust Belt?
Well, you know, every time someone loses an election, there is an autopsy, almost like someone has died, and maybe that's an apt metaphor. I think that her campaign, and Mrs. Clinton personally, relied too much on the results of previous elections, because what we know is that since 1992, in 6 successive presidential elections, and this would be the 7th, that there were a group of states, highly populated, that voted for the Democratic candidate each time, and that all she needed to do was, in effect, preserve what was called the Big Blue Wall, and then win Florida. And that would have elected her. Anything else she would have received would have been of greater benefit, and there were very promising possibilities in a number of other states. So as a result, she chose not to campaign extensively in some of these states, which frankly, she just simply assumed if they have voted this way before, they will vote this way in the future. The problem there was that, of course, in some respects, Barack Obama was a unique candidate because he was African American, and although she did very well with African American voters and other minority voters, not nearly as well as she anticipated. The other real surprise, frankly, was that there was a big expectation that she would do very well among educated Republican voters, especially educated Republican women voters. She certainly did better than President Obama did 4 years ago, but not well enough to carry the day. So what you saw, that when she lost states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan, it is not that she lost it by very big margins. The margins were quite small, but these were all states that she expected to carry very easily, and that was a big miscalculation. Indeed, in Wisconsin, she never campaigned there, ever, not in the entire race. So I think there's a tendency in elections to assume, well, past history is the best predictor of future history. In this case, it did not work out that way, because what Mr. Trump was able to do was to mobilize sentiment, particularly in rural areas, in small cities that have not done well economically, where there's been a great deal of job loss. And the intensity of his support really is what made a big difference. And very frankly, and here the media to some extent can be faulted, that the media tends not to visit these small, remote locations. You go to big cities, that's where there are more people. And as a result, they lost sight of that, and that helps explain her loss.
Speaking of lost sight, Dr. Pollack, I think it's very telling that those states or those villages that Ms. Clinton had taken for granted turned different way in support of other candidate, when we know other candidate coming out to those states and touching the part, giving the message that these voters are really responding strongly in terms of their own economic welfare, try to blame other countries like China, and promising to impose 45% of tax. Can we say that this result of 2016 is a reflection of the changing of voters' tendencies to vote from ideological allegiance to their own welfare or well-being, irrespective of parties?
Well, I think one thing to bear in mind is that this was not a, shall we call it, a very substantive election. It was ugly, it was personal. Things that we never would have imagined would have been said in such an election were said. And that the voters responded, particularly those supporting Mr. Trump, did this not on the basis of some highly detailed understanding of specific issues. They really didn't care. That, you know, we know that Mr. Trump offended so many different groups, women, minorities, said all kinds of offensive things. This didn't seem to really affect his core base of support. At the same time, many of those who at first looked as if they would give more support for Mrs. Clinton chose not to in the end, and actually reverted to the traditional Republican base. So there's an important lesson, I suppose, in all of that. But voters often don't respond on basic, very refined models of what is his policy position, what is her policy, but it's something different. But I would want to emphasize something very, very important, that a lot of people have said that, well, this was a profound overthrowing of the status quo. We've never seen an election like this before. In point of fact, in almost every case of those who have been elected president since 1976, they ran as outsiders. We had Jimmy Carter in 1976. We had Ronald Reagan in 1980. We had Bill Clinton in 1992. We had George Bush in 2000. We had Barack Obama in 2008. And now we had Donald Trump. The only one of those candidates who even lived in Washington, D.C. was Barack Obama, and he was a freshman senator from Illinois. So all of them were in effect saying, we're running against business as usual. We're running against Washington, D.C. The difference with Mr. Trump compared to the others is the others were all politicians.
Exactly.
He was not. Although he had entertained ideas at various times that he would run for president, this was the first time he organized an effort. So he has no political or governmental background. He has a business background and a TV background. But in a way, this made him very popular with certain people, and they believed that this was going to challenge the existing status quo. But as I say, it's not unique to him, but he went in and he had no political obligations to any particular
Yeah.
organized group. In point of fact, he's not a Republican. He's kind of a, he's all of
He's
the
Trump.
He's Trump. He's all of the above. He's been a Democrat. He's registered with other parties. So as a consequence, although he now is identified with the Republican Party and he relies on it, he doesn't have IOUs in the party. And that puts him in an unusual situation that he will either use for advantage or not. We will have to, on that, wait and see.
Okay, thank you very much. Summarizing this U.S. election, and before we move into the next topic, what are the top lessons that you learned from this surprising election?
Well, of course, we're only now about 9 days since the election. I guess what I would learn, or what I think any candidate should learn, I mean, I'm not a political candidate, but is that don't take outcomes for granted. She was far more organized. She had much more money. She had much more media involvement. But you need a clear, consistent message. So even one of the lessons of Mr. Trump is that his speeches would be very simple, not complicated. He would repeat them. They weren't deep, and they had an emotional resonance that, very frankly, hers did not. As she was often acknowledging, she is not a naturally gifted politician, but the failure to somehow find a way to connect to many people, including a lot of her core groups, cost her a lot. Ironically, she made a decision to run against Donald Trump, not to affirm what she was running for, even though there were aspects in her platform and the like that were more positive, but they didn't evoke a great response. She was seen, therefore, not as a candidate of change, but as someone part of the status quo, which has a great deal of truth. Remember also that she is an incrementalist by nature. The tasks when you govern are very, very different from how you campaign. There's a famous phrase attributed to the first Governor Cuomo in New York. And what he said is that you campaign in poetry, you govern in prose. I think she would have governed well in prose, but she didn't have that poetry that a lot of people, I think, were looking for. The other lesson, I suppose, is that don't base your judgments on necessarily what the polls tell you in all cases. Maybe we've become too reliant. We overanalyze these things. You need to have a kind of a sense of, is your message resonating with audiences? So, for example, in her case, her biggest crowds were when she had rock stars, musical performers. That's unfortunately not a good sign, and they should have recognized that. But I think also she made choices in terms of where she campaigned and the like that, in retrospect, because she lost, proved not wise. I must say that compared to her campaign in 2008, her campaign this year was much more disciplined, well organized, well staffed, less feuding and backbiting at the upper level of the campaign. But it didn't, at the end of the day, it didn't make a difference. I think that she somehow believed that as the first woman candidate for president, and as someone who was going to generate great support from different ethnic groups, that would be sufficient. It was not. In fact, ironically, the Latino turnout was not appreciably increased from the past, and Mr. Trump got about the same support among Latinos as Governor Romney did 4 years ago. So all of these are lessons learned. I mean, I can't emphasize enough, it's a singular moment when every 4 years the American people get to choose who they want their president to be. In Korea, of course, it's once every 5 years. But a lot of those decisions are taken in very personal terms, sort of how do I feel about this person? Do I have a connection to that person? And even if Trump was appealing, if you will, to the baser instincts of a lot of people, somehow it attracted people.
Really interesting. Very, very insightful lessons you share with me, with our audience. Let me ask one more question.
Please.
For the benefit of simplification, what is your view? Has Trump won the election, or has Hillary lost the election?
Well, I'd have to say she lost it, because again, if she had been able to generate the support that has been evident in recent elections, she would have won. But that is not to diminish what he was able to achieve. He put together a very unlikely coalition. Remember, he's a billionaire, or he claims to be a billionaire, and yet somehow that fact didn't bother rural voters with very limited means. That's interesting. Remember, by the way, that his personal background is he's from Queens, one of the boroughs of New York, but that's one of the real working class boroughs, and he had a kind of a rougher ethnic or urban quality to him, and that's what people saw, and that's what persuaded them to seemingly to vote for him. But his support, I have to say, was consistent throughout. But I will tell you, from my judgment, based on what I've been able to learn, is that until perhaps 2 weeks before the election, he did not expect to be elected President of the United States. So in the final analysis, things like Mr. Comey's intervention probably made a difference. But even there, you'd have to ask, well, why was Mr. Comey intervening? To be frank, I think that she relied far too much on the judgment of a few people who were very loyal to her. She received very bad advice on this email server. Those things really, really cost her deeply.
Thank you very much. That's excellent summary of the election. Let's move out of U.S. continent and move into more international areas. Before we come into our Korean Peninsula and East Asia, whatever word we may use, such as isolationism, protectionism, there's still discussion and debate whether it's appropriate terms. But his rhetoric during his campaign seemed to indicate rather strongly that he is not such a fan, if I may, or enthusiastic about international cooperation, America first,
Right.
Continuation of Brexit spirit. How this will affect or impact international, let's say, governance system, such as UN,
Sure.
other governance systems.
Yeah. The label I would use is he ran on a nationalist platform, especially economic nationalism, and very much with an eye toward, or a belief that countries should pursue their interests in a way that they almost narrowly define it on their own. The problem with that is that the United States, of course, is a deeply internationally engaged country, and that he tried to apply what he would see as the lessons from the business world, almost that a transactional approach should govern what the U.S. does. But that, very frankly, that reflects the fact that he hasn't had practical political experience. And even right now, although a lot of people want to know what will he do, how will he proceed, I think at the moment, as he tries to deliberate and make decisions about those who he will offer positions to, I think he has been stunned by the magnitude of what now confronts him. You may have noticed that when he met with President Obama at the White House, he seemed very sober.
Regretting?
Well, maybe, I don't know if regretful, but for the moment, just a little stunned at what he must undertake. If I could imagine what the conversation might have been like, I mean, on the one hand, I'm sure President Obama showed him around, showed him how to get from one office to another, or where his washroom is. I mean, I'm joking there, but
I'm sure he did.
He probably did, yeah. But that I'm sure President Obama also told him something else. He probably told him, look, Donald, here are the 15 crises or potential crises that I am dealing with right now, and that I have to confront, and I don't know what's going to happen, and that a lot of these details are not known because they're secret. You keep them secret. He says, they're my problems right now, but in a little over 2 months, they're going to be your problems. And I think that hit Trump very, very hard because he has no practical experience here. His conduct in the business world often is driven almost by impulse
And gut.
and that is a guarantee for making huge mistakes when you govern.
So international governance system is going to be also affected by his, I wouldn't say whimsical, but very gut-oriented thing, which is going to be very important and interesting to observe for the Korean
Of course.
audience. Coming to our Korean Peninsula finally, we have a number of issues, we have a number of lines that wake up Korean audience big time.
Yes.
Let me start with security issues. And it's also related to economics. The military base, U.S. armies in Korean Peninsula. There has been a lot of talk that Koreans are not paying enough for the tremendous service that America has provided. Therefore, we should pay 100%. Has he used it as an example to touch upon or to penetrate into the mindset of the people, or he really meant it? Was it thin rhetoric, or we should take the number as real?
Well, I think, again, this is something that he said in the campaign. I personally think that it's the wrong way to look at these issues. Actually, Korea does contribute a lot, maybe about 45% of the defraying the costs of U.S. personnel here. There's the additional aspect that if U.S. forces were not deployed here, there would be additional costs that otherwise they would not face. But what Mr. Trump, in the campaign at least, was unprepared to acknowledge is that America is not here in Korea simply as a favor to the citizens of Korea. We are here because we believe, on the one hand, that we should protect and help protect Korea's national security and its well-being, but that's also something that America sees in its interest to do, and that the cost is therefore not excessive, and that you can't calculate the value of an alliance on some kind of pure economic numbers calculation. That's the wrong way to see it. There are deeply ingrained and developed relationships that emerge in the context of alliances, and the challenge for Mr. Trump, in part, will be, as he makes the transition to the presidency, is can he begin to understand that this is much more than a business transaction. It's something very, very fundamental about how states conduct their relations.
That's fundamentally important question. Can he realize that this is two-way communication, two-way deals, two-way businesses? What's your prediction? Can he or can he not?
Well, my
within 2 months, or first few months, let's put it this way.
Let's begin with basics. His immediate task is he must, in a very short period of time, organize a governmental process. There's an existing governmental process in terms of the civil servants and so forth. That I don't worry about. I don't think he should worry about that. But he needs to put the machinery in place that he believes will work best for him as he assumes these awesome responsibilities. He's a 70-year-old man. He's a man who thinks very well of himself. He has a big ego. He has a very thin skin. He He gets irritated by anyone, including Mrs. Clinton, who was able to penetrate that veneer. He has to develop a discipline that he has not demonstrated as a candidate. The best example we'll give is that he tweets. And even now, he's been elected president. He's won this singular victory. He's busy tweeting and criticizing the New York Times for something they wrote yesterday. That is, I think, very unhealthy and wrong-headed. So what he needs above all, since I don't think at the age of 70 he's going to undertake a comprehensive remake of his personality, is he needs those who surround him to give him the kind of advice to instruct him in a way as he assumes these responsibilities, because he doesn't have that practical experience that he needs, that understanding, the magnitude of what this involves. The critical test, in a way, is can he listen, can he learn, can he read, because he's almost prideful about the fact he even claims sometimes that he's never finished a book. I don't quite accept that proposition. Nonetheless, he has to cultivate other habits. He has to have an awareness of complexity rather than simplicity, because again, governing and interactions between nations is incredibly complicated. It's not so simple. It's not either or. It's very, very complex. There are enormous trade-offs. Let me give you an example of this. Trump, at different times, has threatened to impose high tariffs on China. Makes him feel good because he claims China has unfair trading practices. It's the same charges he used to level against Japan in the 1980s. Let's just assume, even though I don't think he will, that he imposes 45% tariffs on China. Is that impact limited to China? Oh no. It will have a profound effect on Japan and on Korea and on all the supply chains that exist internationally. So I don't think he either, I'm not emotionally overcome by this, I just had to sneeze, but that as he becomes aware of the consequences, it's that, you know, we talk about what we call strategy. We have a very poor definition of strategy. A lot of people look at strategy and they assume, well, strategy is, here are our goals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4. That's not strategy. Goals are a means to an end. You have to look at if you have a strategy, you're asking, how will my actions affect and improve my circumstances, not just with one actor, but with multiple actors? Will the net result be a better situation or a worse situation? And I would argue here it will be worse, because if for sake of argument he imposes big tariff increases on China, it will, first of all, China will retaliate, either counter tariffs or what have you. Whether it would be a full-scale so-called trade war, I'm not so sure, but all of a sudden American consumers would notice that the price of the products that they want would go up very, very significantly. Trump would be receiving major expressions of concern from Seoul, from Tokyo, from other governments saying, this is disturbing the international trade environment. Global economic growth is already endangered. Do you really? Yeah, you're right. Do you really want to do this? I don't think he's ever thought in those terms, because, as I say, he looks very transactionally, very case specific. What do I need? How much money can I make? What do I get out of this? And then you move on to your next transaction. He, you know, there's a story told, I think it's a true story, told about General Eisenhower before he was president, and someone who knew him well said, you know, poor Ike, he's going to become president, he's going to think it's like the army, that you bark orders and they do this. He says he's going to find it very, very different, and he is going to find it very, very different as he enters the true governing arena.
Indeed, indeed. It comes to, but we all know it's too early to tell how he will perform his duty or carry out his own duties. Very awesome one, as you said. But we all like to predict. So based on 9 days of experience, yes, he continued to tweet, and he continued to burst out, criticize others, and his nominations is nothing but interesting. Whether he will continue, what's your best guesstimate? Will he be one of those previous presidents who was very emotional and out of the norm or very abnormal, but be, I wouldn't say domesticated, but tamed, fitting into the system?
Well, I think
I'm a bit provocative.
No, I understand.
No offense to him.
Yes,
yeah?
right. I think for what Trump must do is he must, first of all, grasp that this is not, shall we say, business as usual. He therefore cannot, in my view, follow the same norms and habits and practices that have always guided and shaped what he does. He must have much more an awareness of consequences, and I will give you an example. He is very close with his children and with his son-in-law. They are his intimate advisors. There are enormous risks in doing this. Why? Mr. Trump is turning over his business activities to his children. Now, these may be children who were very loyal to him and so forth. That's fine. The appearance, or either the reality or the appearance of the reality of a conflict of interest is something that could doom his presidency. That, from what I understand, his inner circle is asking, can his children receive high security clearances? This would be a disastrous mistake. He talks all the time about so-called wanting to build a wall along the border. What some are saying where he needs to build a wall is between his past business world and his new job. He has a new job. He's been hired by the American people. He doesn't want to get fired by the American people like his show used to dictate. So, but I say this very seriously. However much you want to rely on those that you trust, all right? Knowing a lot about the experiences of other presidents, and even here, for example, in Korea, you can look to the experiences of all of your elected presidents, or even some who were not elected. What happens if there's entanglements between their business interests, possible corruption? I'm not accusing his kids of corruption, please understand, but if we look at Korea, why does every president end up in disgrace by the end of their term? Usually implicated because of things that their son did or their brother did or so forth. He has to avoid that, but will he be smart enough to do that? The critical test, I would argue, is does he have someone in his immediate circle who will tell him things that he probably doesn't want to hear, and yet he's able to accept what they tell him. I don't have an answer to that. I don't know how he will react under those circumstances. What I am saying is that because of his very reactive tendencies, impulsive, emotional tendencies, those are not traits that are going to serve him at all well as president. He must keep them under very, very close control, and very frankly, that's going to be difficult for him.
So either he has to be smart enough to realize that this is a different world altogether. It's a very complex system. Or he must have somebody around him who will provide very bitter but very meaningful and important messages, and he has to listen.
He needs to do both. And as I said before, I'm not so sure that at his age it's easy to change. I'm almost as old as Mr. Trump, not quite as old, but it's close. And we have habits of a lifetime. We are what we are, and he is definitely who he is. So, can he make that transition? There's a very there's a focused quality to him in many respects, but there's also a restless quality to him. And the job is difficult enough to begin with, that can he find some way to be a bit more balanced about all of this? I mean, again, I don't know Mr. Trump. I have no access to his inner circle, but he's going to have to operate in a very, very different way, in my view. So I guess I would be very cautious about how I would judge the likelihood of his success. Add to this, in my view, that if he cannot do things that answer the expectations of those who have voted for him, they will begin to drift away from him as quickly as he has mobilized them. That's, if you will, the iron law of politics. The good news maybe is because he is a deal maker. So, for example, the Democrat that he is closest to, interestingly enough, is Chuck Schumer. Schumer is from Brooklyn. Trump is from Queens. They've known each other for a long time. Schumer actually was not that critical of him during the campaign. And Trump called him on the phone. It's important. Politicians like to have their egos fed. Where might he cooperate? Where I think he ought to focus his efforts early in his presidency is not on some kind of grandiose international goals, but on domestic goals. So there's a lot of evidence that he's going to make big commitments to infrastructural development. That's something that a lot of Democrats, even Bernie Sanders, could support. That's something on which he could actually garner Democratic support. On the more negative side, he claims he's going to, Republicans, of course, want a smaller government. They're not going to get a smaller government. If you undertake all this infrastructure, other kinds of programs, you increase the defense budget, this will entail money and it will involve personnel. If he really intends, for example, to expel undocumented immigrants, that needs more personnel. That's growth in government, not shrinkage of government. His proposals for tax reform, I understand that appeals to Republican orthodoxy, but you don't have to be a math expert to recognize that if he undertakes major tax cuts, in particular for people like him, this is going to reduce the available revenue to the United States, and what it will do is that it will have the United States going far more deeply into debt. Now, that may not be a bad thing. If you make smart investments, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that if you think that it yields some results. But this is where he has goals that are difficult to reconcile with one another. And will someone be telling him, Mr. President, this doesn't add up?
Indeed. I think what you describe is extremely interesting, but I guess it also can be summarized as one word: uncertainty. Will he be smart enough? Will he realize that there's a lot of if questions for him to be a successful president for the United States?
Yes.
My last question before we wrap up this interview is how audience or policymakers in outside of U.S., let's say Korea, China, U.S., should see it, be prepared to deal with Trump-led America. What are the advices you have?
Well, what strikes me in this first 9 days is that a lot of foreign governments are taking a careful look at him. They've never quite encountered someone like him before, and they're really trying to see where he goes, how he approaches them. The good news is, I think, in part, is that he's very wisely, he's been contacting people. Among the first leaders that he contacted, of course, were Prime Minister Abe, the Wednesday after he was elected. The next day he contacted President Park. He has spoken to Xi Jinping. He has, of course, spoken to his good friend Vladimir Putin. These are the necessary ways that you communicate both with close allies and with countries where our interests are clearly not always aligned. But you have a kind of I don't call it a mutual respect, but an acknowledgement that they are the leaders of their countries, and you have to deal with them. But that's an important signal, it seems to me. That's kind of a reassuring signal. It's the first test. But, you know, if I look at someone like Xi Jinping in China, Xi has a very ambitious agenda confronting him. He's got a lot of problems to wrestle with. He's trying to present signals of how he really wants to cooperate and collaborate with the United States, rather than you know, make threatening noises about if you dare to introduce these tariffs. That would be a foolish step to take, and he's not doing that. So if Trump is smart enough about that, he will recognize that, and he will try to find a way to build on it. The issues for your government, it seems to me, are compounded hugely by the crisis that President Park confronts today. It's the biggest uncertainty here, and it's why, frankly, if you combine the uncertainties associated with a very different president of the United States, who even says that he will conduct alliances on a different basis, whether he will or not, we don't know, compounded by her own pressures, combined by all the risks and concerns about North Korea, that's a very, very complex and maybe even worrying situation. So my hope would be that those around him would advise him in a way to make him aware of how other countries define their interests, what their fears are, what their goals are. What he needs to be able to do is something that I suspect he's not been very good at, and that is to be empathetic. There's a difference between empathy and sympathy. He can articulate, and he should articulate, things about why he thinks he has priorities, American interests ought to come first. My argument would be, that may be so, but often American interests dictate the kinds of collaboration that we've often seen with the outside world, because there is no real alternative to that. Does he understand that? Does he grasp it? Does he understand what it will require to be attentive to these issues? You know, George Shultz, who was really one of the really outstanding secretaries of state of the last period of time, used to say that foreign policy is kind of like gardening. You have to tend to it, you have to pick out the weeds, you have to make sure that the crops the flowers are not diseased and so forth. Does Trump have the diligence and the patience to conduct his policies on that basis? We will all find out soon enough.
All right. With a very interesting conclusion, let me thank you for your time for this very interesting conversation. And your thought and analysis has been very useful, and your advice to our own citizens and audience will be highly appreciated.
Thank you.
Once again, thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you.
Pollack. Thank you.